Thanks, Belinda, and thanks everybody for coming out on this fairly gray, rainy Friday afternoon. I hope it's a good time for all of you to sort of end the week with some thoughts that maybe are of interest to you, certainly of interest to your work as development scholars and practitioners, and certainly interesting conversation I hope that we can have after or during the session, whenever you want to interrupt me is fine, about some of the issues. It's been such a hot time in the area of digital development, and the presentation I was going to make for this session changed because of events in North Africa, where I realized that I wasn't going to talk about the changing sort of situation in Africa per se, but go a little bit more globally to talk about why we're really at a point in history where development doesn't make any sense anymore. So there's one line to throw out, where development doesn't make any sense anymore, and where we're in a constant state of making sense of the issues that have been associated with development, like poverty, food security, sustainable environments, and how we might appreciate and approach these in the future as a global system, not as the North and the South. So my presentation today is very much about a new way of understanding development with a digital face, no longer necessarily a human face, where machines and technology becomes absolutely center point to many of the innovations that are occurring in the world, that are linking people across the globe, and also how these technical innovations are influencing social relations and institutional changes that lie at the heart of some of these very wicked problems like poverty, food insecurity, and unsustainable environments. So I have a few starting points, four exactly. So first of all, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the fact that we live in this very exciting age of digital development that many of us take for granted. We also live with 20th century, so not that long ago, but 30, sometimes 40, 50-year-old myths in our work on information and communication that we really have to debulk ourselves from. We have to step outside of these myths in the new digital development. We should also recognize that many of the people who could be associated with being techno enthusiasts need to temper a lot of their arguments with an understanding of what social exclusion is and how unequal power relationships within society and institutions influence what we see and how we use technology in digital development. And then finally, some of the new frontiers. And I wanted to finish off with this, not just because it's the typical way of wrapping up a presentation, but I want to throw out a challenge to those of us who work in development related to the first comment I made, which is I really think I think we're looking at the end of development as we know it right now, and it's a fairly sobering thought, but at the same time it's a very exciting time to look at some of the new challenges for development studies for programs like the one here at the University of Guelph and around the world in terms of the development industry. So let's start with just a basic recognition that we live in a highly digitized world. In last month's issue of Science, there was a special issue around how far we've come from the period of 1986 to 2007. And many of us who work in the area of information and communication related studies know that we have made massive gains in terms of the way that we can store and communicate and compute information. But it really hit those of us in academia to see a summary issue of Science where we begin to realize some of the huge gains in computing capacity that have been met in a fairly short period of time, like so since 1986. And for some students in this university, they were born after 1986. So it is a fairly sobering idea to notice that the world's capacity for bidirectional telecommunications is at an unprecedented high, that we're starting to see growth rates of around 30% per year, and that we have this massive ability to store information globally. At the same time, we are shedding off old forms of communication and information, in particular unidirectional information flows. What were typically called information dissemination models, or information flows that were from sender to receiver, one-way flows. These really, through broadcasting channels, and we'll look at some of those broadcasting channels historically in a second, but through these historic broadcasting channels, radio, television, etc., the growth in those media are very low, 6%. So you see this massive juxtaposition between bidirectional and unidirectional media use. As well, telecommunications now is at about 99.9% digital. So we have not just left the age of analog, we have actually moved into entirely new ways of being able to manipulate digital information since 2000. That's only 1 decade ago, 10 years ago. So many of you know the symptoms, the signs and symptoms of information overload. It's not just simply going home at the end of the day and saying, okay, my head's going to burst. It's also about the fact that we live in such a digital existence now, where we downplay, because we live in such a small part of this digital world, the actual traffic that is occurring in bidirectional communication. So I just highlighted a few of the stats that were produced in that special report on science. So for instance, the fact that many of us know that we get sometimes hundreds of email messages every day, but did you know that 89.1% of the emails on a daily basis are spam? So you can see that a lot of the traffic is just spam. You can see the amount of email accounts worldwide, 2.9 billion. Number of websites as of last December, 255 million. About 25% of those are in the corporate sector, so those are corporate websites. And the importance here is that 75% of the email accounts are actually consumer or individual, non-corporate email accounts. Domain names, of course, are a big issue right now in the news, the fact that we're running out of domain names, but the increase has been about 7% a year. So that's not perhaps a strong stat in terms of saying, okay, that's a huge increase, but what's important is that there's a finite number of them, and so there's a lot of discussion, as you probably heard, about what will happen. What's really interesting is to see what's happened with the blogosphere, the blogs on the internet. So 152 million, and new accounts on Twitter, 100 million. So you can see that this overload, this information overload, is part and parcel of our daily existence as individuals, but it's happening to us around the world. When Belinda was introducing me, I think that bio, I have to go back and update it because I'm thinking 15 years, and I'm embarrassed to say that it's actually probably closer to like 25 or 27 now that I've been working in international development. And my first work, I grew up just outside of Guelph on a farm here in this area, and I went to high school in Guelph. And one of the ways that I could earn money on the side of being a high school student was to volunteer at the YMCA. At that time, the YMCA is nothing like the corporation that it is today. It was a bit simpler community-based organization. It ran a number of different training workshops, and I used to go in and just literally do like typing and photocopying and help with the Y. And one day, this application came across my desk, and it said, would you have any volunteers in the Guelph area who would like to go and work in the Andes of Peru? So I'm just doing my typing and filing, and I thought, oh, that's okay, I think I could do that. So I put my name on it. I didn't tell my parents, 17 years old. In the end, what happened is I did go to Peru, and it started a lifelong journey for me to work in international development. And the experience of working in the Andes of Peru, I always think back to it, and I think, you know, it's about 30 years ago. So fair enough, 30 years ago. And our extent of information in the Andes of Peru, outside, 8 hours outside of Huancayo, which is one of the larger Andean towns in central Peru, consisted of a dump truck, a lorry, that would come every Tuesday and would carry a newspaper with it. And while there, I would try to tune in and get some kind of shortwave radio messages or programming was often very sketchy because of the cloud and the overcast in this area. And as well, letters from home were usually at least 6 to 8 weeks late. And so when I think about 30 years ago, when I first worked in international development, there was no active information. There was certainly no information overload, and there was no really very quick communication. I made a phone call home on New Year's Eve to my family in Canada, and it cost a whopping 300 Canadian dollars. And it was probably a phone call of 5 or 6 minutes. And that's how expensive it was to make what was called a trunk call, a mainline telephone call from Peru to Guelph. And these are the realities that we face, is that in our careers, we're going to see this massive shift in information and communication structures that many of us have experienced personally. And therefore, we can think a little bit about those around the world who are younger or even older, who are seeing a huge, massive digital revolution take place in front of their eyes. I'm not sure how many of you have seen this. This is one of the heat maps for Facebook, so Facebook's heat maps. And what this represents is the Facebook traffic around the world right now. What you're seeing with the blogosphere and with many of the platforms in the internet right now is absolute phenomenal growth. 250 million people on Facebook in 2010. What's interesting is 70% are outside of the United States. And there's 20 million new Facebook apps installed each day on various devices. The reason I started by talking a little bit about the fact that our concept of development has to change, and that this face of digital development is the face that we're going to be seeing more and more of, is that the picture of what's happening with information and communication technologies in relationship to development is changing very, very quickly. And since the first quarter of 2010, you can see the new mobile net additions. So these are mobile devices, smartphones, cell phones, mobile phones, whatever you want to call them, mobile connections from laptops, etc., being added into the digital context. So you can see China with this whopping 31%, India 25%. The rest of the world, other than Russia, Brazil, and USA, Middle East, is about 21%. But what is really fascinating to those of us who've worked on issues around the digital divide and information communication technology and development is Africa. Africa, the first quarter of 2010, 12%. We don't have data for later quarters in 2010 yet, but this is something that is really quite remarkable, and we'll talk more about that. When we look at the notion of what digital futures are going to be, I talk a lot about the haves and the have-nots. So those who have access to the digital world, and those who do not have access for a number of reasons that we'll talk a little bit about in the presentation. And I also talk about this third category. I talk about the will-nots. With any kind of technology, there's always a component of society who will not engage with technology. These are not Luddites. This is not the classic notion of the Luddites. These are not anti-technology people. These are just simply people who consciously make a decision not to engage with the digital world. They are a group that is spread all over the world, and it's a group that probably is shifting as age and generations begin to develop new behaviors. Older individuals adopting new technologies, individuals deciding to change their lives and to quit the information highway, sign off of Facebook, close an email account that they no longer use, disengage from the digital world. And then thirdly, the group that never joined in the first place and have no intention of it. And that is a very live group.